going to go ahead and get started here. First of all, thank you so much for coming. This means a great deal to me. It's exciting. I want to thank a few special people. First of all, Greg, I'll catch Greg as soon as he's done at the register there, but Greg Edelman, who of course owns this gallery, and in addition to just doing a nice service for the community by having the gallery, he's really great about making this available for community events of all sorts. And so I want to thank him for, there's Greg. Thank you very much for hosting this fine event. You're very welcome. And before you leave, definitely look around the walls of the gallery, and I'm sure you might find something that you'll go, that belongs in my living room. And I'm sure Greg will help make that happen.
And the holidays are coming up, so if you see something, tell your other half and say, I found something I like.
Something for everyone on your Christmas list. And speaking of other halves, my husband, Jeff, who is videotaping this for me as well, but he supports me every step along the way. He reads everything I write and provides critical feedback. He gives me suggestions. The title of my next book came from a suggestion of his. And the biggest thing is, a lot of times we'll be sitting there eating dinner and I'll be lost in space and he'll be going, what are you thinking about, dear? And I say, my book. And that seems to be a constant state and he puts up with it. And so, thank you. And I'd like to thank my friend Scott Thomas, who also came and helped set up and everything. And then last thing, my family from Southern California, my sister-in-law Juanita, my niece Suzanne, my, I guess it would be great niece and great nephew, but RJ and Lily, totally surprised me by flying in here today for this. I am totally blown away. So what I want to do is I'd like to, first of all, talk a little bit about, many of you know I'm also like a trombonist and a retired software engineer and all this sort of thing. What the heck am I doing writing books? So I'll help to answer that question for you a little bit. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what the books are like or what they're about. And they are the first two in a series, and I'll give you a little hint as to what the rest of the series might be about as well. So first of all, for a good bit of my life, I'm not one of these people that have had a dream ever since I was this big. One day I'm going to write the great American novel, so that just never really occurred to me. I was more interested in music and all that. But as I was approaching retirement, and I got interested in retirement lifestyle planning, and originally I was positioning myself more as a speaker for that, but I started writing, and I wrote articles and blog posts and everything, and next thing you knew, I had written 3 books on that, and I discovered that I really like writing. And I can at least put together a good sentence. It's one of those journeys that you never finish. There's always better to become as a writer, but after doing retirement for about 8 years, I felt I had covered all that pretty well. And I was ready for a new challenge, something new to do, and I had these ideas for stories I wanted to tell. And so I got started. I actually started this in 2017. And I do little stabs at it here and there, and wasn't really making that much progress. But finally, it wasn't long before the pandemic hit, I decided I'm going to get serious. And if you read any articles or blogs or anything that talk about how to be a good writer, they say you have to do some writing every single day. So I booked 2 hours in the study room, and only because they limit you to 2 hours. But at Chandler Public Library, I book 2 hours every day. I go there every day and write. And several years later, now we have 2 books out. And my third one, I've done about 4 rounds of editing on, and I'm about to send it out to beta readers. And my 4th one, I finished the first draft. So it's kind of one of these, an overlapping stair step of each book, So I've gotten into it and I've enjoyed it, and it keeps me out of trouble. So I think that's probably the most important thing. So let me tell you a little bit about these books and why I decided to write them. First and foremost, everybody likes a good story. So my goal number one is just to write an entertaining, well thought out, good story for you. But I sort of have a second goal as well, and that's this. You'll notice as soon as you start reading either of these that every chapter has a date at the beginning of it. This book, maybe next year, takes place during the summer of 2007, when the two main characters are finishing up their junior year of high school. And this book takes place in 2007 through 2008, when the main character is in his senior year of high school. Now you're probably wondering, why 2007 and 2008 and not just an indeterminate year or this year or whatever? Well, there's two reasons. The first is, as I mentioned, there's a series of 6 books, and in each book the characters age. Each one covers sort of a chapter or a period of time in their life. And as I've envisioned it now, the series ends with these characters in their early 30s. Well, if they're in their early 30s today, that means it had to be back in 2007 when they were 17 years old. So I did that, one, so that the characters could properly age into their roles throughout the books. But also, I thought it was important to document what was going on in our country and in our society during those times, particularly with regard to the gay community. Because, for example, in 2007, in the mid-2000s, there was a big movement underway, essentially the ex-gay movement and the gay conversion therapy movement. There were organizations like Exodus International and Focus on the Family and things like that that were very active and getting a lot of press, and they were getting a lot of mileage out of trying to convince people, especially in the more religious end of the spectrum, that, oh, you can pray the gay away. And there were therapists that had practices. I mean, in the 2008 election, Michelle Bachmann's husband ran one of these gay conversion therapy practices and got funding from the federal government. And that was 15 years ago, and it seems like so long, we've almost forgotten about it because things for us are relatively really good these days. But if you just look how the political pendulum is swinging the other way again, I think it's important to remember where we've come from and where we've been, so that we don't end up going back there again. So, not very happy stuff, I know, but one of the main kind of points in this book is these two characters, juniors in high school, they've been best friends for 3 years. They finally realize there's a little more to their friendship than just being good friends. And one of them, their parents are very open-minded, very accepting and all that. The other one, Brian, his father happens to be the pastor of the largest megachurch in the Kansas City, in the state of Kansas. So what could possibly go wrong, right? So obviously things happen, the father and mother find out their kid is gay, and they try to send him through all of these anti-gay therapy things, and that's covered in here. So this book has a little bit of everything. There's romance in it, there's humor, there's drama, a couple secrets get revealed later on. I'm not going to give you very many spoilers about that. But anyway, what ends up happening, of course, near the end of the book is Brian ends up deciding that he really needs to leave home to escape everything that his dad's putting him in. Enter this book here, Instant Adult. Brian ends up in Los Angeles, beginning of his senior year of high school, completely a guy on his own, 17 years old, in a big city to fend for himself, and this is his journey. Fortunately, he lucks into a situation where he rents a room from a guy who has a house near UCLA, and so he has 3 other gay college student roommates and his landlord, who is a UCLA alumnus and is now an attorney, and they become his new family. Okay, so I'd like to read a little bit of this from this for you. And one of the things that happens in this book is the landlord, who really is kind of like everybody's kind of big brother, kind of dad, mentor, whatever, but certainly their landlord, has a family night dinner every Sunday night. I mean, the rest of the week, the guys are going back and forth in classes and everything else they have going on, but Sunday evening, he fixes dinner for them, and then they watch movies or play games or whatever. So, what I want to read to you is the family night dinner. The first week, Brian is there. And I chose this because each of the other characters kind of introduces themselves in a capsule. So you get an idea of what the characters in this book are about. And the other thing I'll say before we get started is, you will hear me interchangeably using Brian and Ryan. And the reason for that is, Brian decides, of course he's running away from home, and he's worried about his parents finding him and all that. He's decided he needs to change his name. Now, he can't legally change his name until his birthday on October 14th, but he figures I might as well introduce myself to people now as Ryan, so they don't start calling him Brian and then have to learn to recall him Ryan and all that stuff. So in the narrative, he's Brian. In the verbiage, he's Ryan. Got that? Clear as mud. Actually, I asked my beta readers for this, did you find this too confusing? And they say, no, we get it, we understand, we know why you did it, so that's fine. So Brian emerged from his room shortly before 6 o'clock with a can of Dr. Pepper in hand. Hal is the landlord. Hal and Ricky were in the kitchen, and Ted was setting the table. Hal had just removed 2 homemade pizzas from the oven and was slicing them with a roller cutter. They looked fantastic. Hal offered Brian a beer, and he'd never had a beer before, and he decided to try it. He made a quick trip back to his room to return the Dr. Pepper to the fridge. After everyone sat down and served themselves a couple of slices, Hal raised his beer and said, "A toast to the newest member of our family, Ryan." Everyone clinked their bottles with each other and took a sip. Brian didn't care for it, but he decided to be gracious and drink it anyway. Hal continued, "I thought it might be a nice idea for each of us to say a little bit about ourselves so Ryan can feel a little bit more at home. I'll start. I grew up in Encino, not too far north of here. My parents disowned me and kicked me out when they found out I was gay. I was able to couch surf with my friends for a little while, but I found out that you can overstay your welcome quickly, so that was just a short-term solution. Back then, the LGBT Youth Project existed, but it was much smaller and they didn't have nearly the resources they have today. But they were able to help me out a little. That's why I volunteer and contribute money to them, so I can help make it better for young people who are getting kicked out of their homes now. I did my undergrad at UCLA in the mid-'80s and went to their law school. I loved UCLA then, and I still do today. But it was rough for me to make it through college on my own, so I wanted to do something to help guys who find themselves in a tight financial situation. I wanted to live close to UCLA, and I also wanted to offer a place to stay for gay college students, especially if they've been kicked out by their families or harassed in the dorms. So I bought this house in, I guess it was 1995. So it's been 12 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. And of course, getting to live with several hot young college guys isn't too bad either. Ricky, how about you? Ricky finished chewing the bite of pizza he had just put in his mouth and then began. I'm Ricky Montez. It's short for Enrique. I'm a sophomore, although I'm taking a break for now until I can figure out what I want to be when I grow up. Ted interjected, "Dude, you're trying to figure out how you can keep from growing up." Ricky laughed. "And what's wrong with that? Anyway, so I'm working and trying to save up some money and trying to have a good time while I figure things out." Brian asked, "Where are you from?" "El Paso. My family knows I'm gay, and they're kind of okay with it, but it's kind of like we just won't talk about it, you know? I go back for a visit once in a while, like for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I mean, I love my family and I want to stay in touch with them, but I don't fit in there anymore. Besides, my dad's an alcoholic, so it's not always pleasant to be around him. And they're always just kind of struggling to get by. So I'm better off here, where I can be myself and live my life the way I want. Ted said, well, I guess I'm next. I'm Ted Purcell. I'm from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Like Ricky, I don't belong there anymore. My mom and dad split up when I was 10. Mom realized she was a lesbian when she fell in love with one of the other women in the neighborhood. When they were getting their divorce, the judge gave Dad full custody of me because, you know, she was a lesbian and the judge was a homophobe. I think my dad had the better attorney. So Mom and her partner moved to Northampton, Massachusetts. I guess a lot of lesbians live there, and it's much more liberal and tolerant. Anyway, besides Dad losing his wife, he lost his job when steel mills started closing down. If you've heard that Billy Joel song about Allentown, it pretty much hits the nail right on the head. So he started drinking a lot, and he was kind of an asshole to be around. When I started figuring out I was gay, I knew there was no way I could tell him. I started working out at the gym, both to build myself up and just to get out of the house, you know? And I could tell that some of the other guys at the gym were probably gay, so it was good to see some other people like me. After I got out of high school, he had no money to send me to college, and I wanted to get the hell out of there, so I joined the Marines. Dad was all for that. I think he suspected that I was gay, and he thought the Marines would make a man out of me. A straight man, that is. Plus, I think he was glad to have me gone. That was 2000. Little did I know that 9/11 would happen the next year, and I would get sent to Afghanistan. Fortunately, I made it back. Some of my buddies didn't. Anyway, I ended up at Camp Pendleton, which is halfway between here and San Diego. I didn't want to re-enlist, so I got out and started going to UCLA. The GI Bill pays for my tuition, and thanks to Hal, I can live here affordably, so that all worked out. I'm heading into my senior year majoring in accounting. I'm applying to get into the Anderson School of Business and get a master's in international business. So if I get accepted, I'll be here for a couple more years. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Hal said, and then there's Darnell. He'll be back around the beginning of September. He's out there touring the country, the world actually, as his alter ego, the fabulous Miss Whitney Austin. Brian said, so he's a drag queen? Ricky replied, mm-hmm. And not just your run-of-the-mill lip-syncing drag queen. That girl can sing. Ted said, she's amazing. Her routine is part singing, part comedy routine, and part social commentary. Ricky added, and all fabulous. She's pretty fabulous when she's not in drag, too. Hal said, she's been performing in Provincetown most of the summer. In a couple weeks, she'll fly to Europe to perform on a gay Mediterranean cruise. Brian's eyes opened wide. They have gay cruises? Hal replied, yeah, there are 6 or 8 every year. They go to the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and a bunch of other places. Ricky said, I don't know. I mean, I love gay men and everything, but 2,000 queens on a ship? I don't know if I could handle that. Let's see. Hey, Rick. So they bantered back and forth, and Ricky noticed, so Ted didn't appear to be the least bit ruffled by that exchange, but Brian looked shocked and a little bit uncomfortable. Banter of this nature was completely foreign to him. He thought, is this how these guys talk to each other all the time? I'm going to have to learn a whole new set of conversational skills to fit in here. Ricky noticed his discomfort and said, oh honey, don't mind us. We carry on like this all the time. It's all in fun. Nobody means any harm. We're all different, but we're a family. So now tell us about you. Okay, so where to begin? Let's see, I'm from Kansas City. Actually, one of the suburbs on the Kansas side. I'm going to be a senior at Westwood High School over on the other side of the 405. Then I hope I can go to UCLA. I love music, especially jazz, and I play the trumpet. Don't worry, I have a mute to muffle the sound, so my practicing shouldn't bother you. Let me know if it does. I also ran on the track team for the last couple years at my high school. Anyway, my father, or should I say my ex-father, is the pastor at a very large, very conservative church. He found out I was gay about a month ago, and he pretty much crapped his pants. He grounded me, took away my phone, and said I could never see my boyfriend again. And they were going to take me out of the public high school where I had all my friends and band and track, and send me to this little Christian high school. Then they tried sending me to this so-called counselor. He wasn't a real psychologist or psychiatrist or anything like that. He was this creepy dude with a PhD in theology. He thought that if I just prayed every day, God would cure me of being gay. So after about 3 weeks, I told him I wasn't going to see him anymore. Then my dad and this counselor made plans to send me to this place in Alabama, where they tried to perform some kind of gay conversion therapy on kids. Luckily, I found out about it the day before they were going to take me there, and I ran away. I just threw a bunch of my stuff in a couple of suitcases and got on the next bus to LA. I showed up at the LGBT Youth Project this past Monday, and they hooked me up with Hal. Thankfully, Hal had a room available, so here I am. And that's enough. I've been reading for you for long enough now. Let me ask you now, open it up. Do you have any questions? And almost anything is fair game.
To me, it sounds almost like Tales of the City. Armstead Maupin's family, the head of the family, they all meet once a week for dinner, just like Mrs. Mandergill was the social director of the condo.
That's very perceptive, thank you. You know, I was going to say, if anybody asked the question, who are my influences, that was certainly one of them.
It sounds like it.
And I have kind of structured these books the same way he structured Tales of the City.
And somebody had said that you have a series coming out, and I said, oh, so did Armstead Maupin.
Yeah.
And I, of course, as soon as I would finish one, it's like, I can't wait to get my hands on the next one. You know, hurry up.
Yeah, thank you. And that's true. I mean, just like with that, this book sort of follows Brian and his nucleus of friends through various stages of his life. The next book is going to be his college years. The next book, we fast forward like about 4 years. He's 28. He has taken a job with a high-tech firm in Scottsdale, and he gets assimilated into the Phoenix community and meets someone special. The next book covers both them getting married, but also, you know, he leaves behind all of his family's friends, his boyfriend, Chris, all that stuff here. Sooner or later, you can't escape the past. Almost everybody from this book reemerges in his life at some point in a future book. And so, yeah, this is very much structured like Tales of the City, in that each book is like a chapter of this person's life and some of the other lives that are intertwined with it.
I assume in books 5, 6, and 7, you're going to hit pretty heavily on the nation's politics at the time, the Trump era, and then into the Biden era, and then coronavirus too. How much of that do you think will be mentioned, or is it just going to be like a glance?
It kind of depends on what the particular incident is. For example, at the beginning of my next book, book 3, his freshman year of college, of course, is the fall of 2008. Well, what was going on in the fall of 2008 in California? Prop 8, right? So that factors into the book. And the Obama-McCain election, that sort of thing. Later in one of the books, remember about 5 years ago, there was the shooting at the Pulse nightclub.
Right.
That's mentioned peripherally, but that incident changed some people's minds. And then you mentioned the coronavirus. The last book, what's now the last book, who knows, I might make up some more stuff, but who knows? But the pandemic is a part of their lives, and I'm not going to have anybody get COVID, but the characters are going to be affected by being separated by the ban on international travel and being isolated in their homes and how that impacts their relationships. And so that part is very much going to be part of the book.
I'm always curious to know how a writer comes up with what name, like why Brian and not Scott or Steve or Gary. I mean, it's just baffling. I mean, it's easy for you to talk, and I've already identified with these characters, so it's like, I'm not a writer, so I'd like to know how you come up with a million names. How do you settle on one?
Okay, that's a good question. In a lot of ways, I don't have a real good answer. In a lot of ways, I do just make them up. Now, there is one thing you'll learn about Brian's family when you start reading the book. They have this thing with names that start with BR. And some families do that, you know. His dad is Brad, his mom is Brenda. He's Brian and his younger brother is Brandon. In a later book, he meets a cousin. And because his dad's a fundamentalist minister, he and the rest of his family kind of go separate ways. But he ends up meeting a cousin of his, Brady. So, BR names, you know, there's that. But otherwise, for the most part, I make them up. And in fact, I try my best to choose names that aren't going to be too reminiscent of people I actually know, because I don't want to say, you're really this person. So basically, I totally make them up. Yes.
And I think a lot of us can identify with exactly what he's done. I mean, especially from people like me who grew up in the 60s and 70s who weren't so much accepted. We took on other identities. We also took on new family. For example, I always say I've got two types of family. I have my biological and I have my logical. The logical families are the ones that I chose, just like he's doing. And they make a lot more sense than biological ones in my life anyway. But I think that, it's very easy to identify with exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
They're interesting to me.
Yeah.
Where do you get inspiration for your characters? Like, are they just like alter egos or something?
Well, that's a good point. People have asked me, is this autobiographical? Are any of these characters really you? And the surface answer to that is no. However, Jeff in particular will tell you that he sees parts of me in a lot of these characters. I mean, especially like Brian, he's in his school jazz band and he loves jazz. Gee, where did I get that? The guy he meets in the fourth book, after he's moved here to the Phoenix area and he meets a guy here, that guy plays trombone. Any resemblance? No. And the guy talks him into joining Desert Overture and all that stuff. So it's named something else in the book, but yeah. So there are, and the other thing, I'll be real honest, I mean, a couple of the characters in this book, Ted, you'll find out, is a real wine connoisseur. And Hal also is to some extent, and also is, you know, kind of into mixology. It's like, I don't know where that came from either. But, so yeah, there are parts of me in some of these characters, but, so in a lot of ways, they're composites of other people I know. There's a fellow I met probably almost 20 years ago now. I only knew him briefly, but he was like 6'7", blonde, handsome, smart as heck, and just a really, really nice guy. But when he came out, his parents cut him off. And he was my model for Brian. I've long since lost touch with him, but both visually and his life story, he was my model for Brian. Aiden?
I guess the main character is like born this week, 1990 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that's he's a little bit younger than you.
Maybe a few years.
So I'm just wondering, like the language of a 17-year-old in 2007 would be different from when you were 17 or even us now.
Mhm.
So, like, did you have to think hard or work hard to figure out how would all those characters speak at that time, at that age?
Yeah, that's a real good question. Because a friend of mine who's a very accomplished author, his name's Bill Konigsberg, and I know some of you know him. He writes young adult novels, and he's really big on, you have to write the novels in the language your characters really speak, or they won't believe you. You know, they'll take a look at this, and this is so inauthentic, and you've lost them. So what I did for these books is, I have several friends that I knew through Desert Overture who went to high school in 2007 and 2008, and I asked them, write down as many as you can think of, whatever slang words, expressions, you know, things about how you spoke in 2007 and 2008. You know, write them down and send them to me. And they did. They gave me a really good list. And I remember, you know, to some extent we all adopt some of those phrases, but so I put those in throughout my writing. And I read it, and I thought, this seems so forced. It's just like, it just didn't seem right. I left some of it in, but a lot of it I took back out. And the other thing too is, this is how I've defined my audience. I'm not really writing for the young adult market. And Bill Konigsberg is. And the young adult, which is actually a very hot book market, is like 12 through 19. And they're voracious readers, and there's lots of books being written for that age level. My book is primarily written for middle-aged or older, you know, gay male adults. And so we didn't all necessarily talk like that either. So that gave me a little bit of a break. So, you know, there's some things in there that I kept because it sounded natural, but other stuff, it just sounded forced, and I took it out.
Forgive me if this is a writing group question we'll go to next week, but you have beta readers, and your writing has a much more lighter touch. It's not very cynical at all. It's not like hit you over the head with this. Does your writing start out a little heavier, and does it get lightened up, or is it just kind of naturally kind of slice of life?
I think it ends up the way it started. I didn't go back through and say, okay, this is too dark, I'm going to lighten this up, or there's not enough humor, I need to find some humor to stick in. The tone of the writing pretty much stays the same. But you mentioned the beta readers. One thing that I found is really useful, and I totally didn't need these when I was writing nonfiction, retirement books, but writing fiction books, I found it to be very valuable. I find 4 to 6 people who are willing to give me critical feedback, and I let them read an advanced copy, and then hopefully they throw darts at it, and then I can come back and make whatever changes they suggest. In other words, they're giving me feedback on the reader experience. What's it going to be like for the person who consumes the book? Having said that, if any of you would like to be a beta reader, come talk to me afterwards. I could use a couple more. Yes?
What did you find hardest or most interesting about this whole writing process?
What did I find the hardest or most interesting? That's a good question. Okay, and actually, probably my best answer is this. The hardest thing for me is knowing what I need to cut out. Okay? Because, a lot of people when they write, they say, oh, when you write, don't filter yourself, just type, let the words all flow out and all that. You can go back and clean it up and edit it later. I can't do that. I'm too much of a perfectionist. I will say, no, that's an awkward phrase, back up. And I might spend 5 minutes getting that phrase right and then I go on. But that's me and I have to work that way. But that, I have less cleanup to do later. But to get back to your question, I mean, especially for the book number 3 that I'm trying to work on now, there are sections of the storyline where I need to think, does this really need to be in the book? Or can I take it out and nobody would miss it? Does it add to or detract from the book? And it's hard for me to be objective about that. So yeah, I need to, the hardest thing for me is knowing what I need to cut out. And that's why having other people's opinions helps. The most interesting thing, I've actually done quite a bit of research into this. It's fiction, you know, supposedly fiction, you can just make everything up. But for the high schools they went to, I found the actual high schools in those communities. They're named something different, but I learned things about their band program or the makeup of their student body and things like that. At one point, you know, Brian's on his bus ride from Prairie Village, Kansas out to Los Angeles. I actually looked up the Greyhound timetables and where they would, what routes they took and when they stopped at various cities, just to learn about that stuff and to incorporate that in the book. And the route the bus took when it was driving in I-10 into Los Angeles. Of course, I've driven that road a number of times, but I spent a lot of time on Google Street View, looking at the neighborhoods these kids live in and what the schools look like and all that stuff. So doing the research was actually a lot of fun. But I wanted to make it real, even though it's fictional, have it seem real. So that you don't read and go, this is nonsense, you know.
Well, the reader can identify
Yes.
with local names of streets or cities or establishments.
And the characters seem more real.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like when he arrives in Los Angeles and he wants to change his name and he wants to become emancipated from his parents. And, you know, advice he got from somebody in Kansas was, you know, go to this LGBT center. They have volunteer attorneys. They'll help you get your name changed and help you get emancipated from your parents. Well, he met with this guy, and it turned out to be Hal, and he said, when do you turn 18? In 3 months. He said, well, the emancipation process takes 4 to 6 months, and you have to have your parents' consent. So it's like, well, okay, that's not going to work. And similarly, he can't legally change his name. If he does it before he turns 18, he needs his parents' consent. And so I researched all those laws so that I'd be able to write about it accurately. Anything else? Yes, Suzanne.
Your niece. Like, I admire your restart as an author, and like in hearing you share all of this is so enlightening. Like, what comes to mind when you think about how Brian, or this is 2-part or 1 part, if you just want to answer 1 part, what comes to mind when you think about how Brian, or becoming an author and developing Brian as a character, has impacted you? Like, it seemed, you know, you've sort of started a whole new chapter, right? Through all of this, so I'm curious if anything comes to mind.
Well, you mean, in other words, after writing about Brian, or making up his story and writing about his experiences, how has that impacted me?
Yep.
I don't know. That's a great question, but I don't know that I have a good answer for that. So yeah, you stumped me on that. Now, however, I will say that embarking on this journey as a writer has impacted me in several ways. I mean, for one thing, I now can, first of all, can appreciate what other writers go through when they write. You know, if I look at something, you know, I'm much more inclined to dig into why the author wrote that and what they wanted to say and stuff like that, instead of just taking a book at a very surface level. And I have a much greater appreciation for the craft of writing, even though I've learned this much and there's still this much to learn. I mean, you never stop learning, but I think it has really caused me to grow a lot in terms of my appreciation of the art of writing. And was there a second part?
Well, if, no, it's okay.
I was just going to comment in response to your question. We should probably ask Jeff later.
I was just gonna.
You can capture that off camera.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, now go with your second question.
No, I think you covered it. I was just thinking like what you've written about and how it's become a story and just, you know, being a little younger than you, but not a lot. I would imagine it's almost cathartic to sort of write out some of this journey that you've been on, experienced, and had to, you know, be a part of.
Yeah, you know, an interesting thing about the young adult genre, and both of these two books, this one especially, and this one kind of gets into some adulty subject matter, but still you know, Brian is 17 and his housemates are in their early 20s. So, you know, both of these are kind of young adult-ish, but one thing I learned is that even though these young adult books are targeted to 12 to 19-year-olds, anywhere between 55 to 70%, depending on what source you go to, 55 to 70% of the readers are older adults. And I think the reason for that is, when we were younger, very few people were telling our stories. There was Armistead Maupin, there was, you know, the front runner, by Patricia Nell Warren, and just a handful of others. But, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, we were much more invisible and nobody was telling our stories. And I think now, even as older readers, it's just great to read stories about what it was like to be gay and grow up and all that stuff. And I'd like to ask you folks a question here, especially those of you who are among the not quite young adult audience. Last week, Bill Konigsberg gave an author talk here, and he said, you know, there still seems to be practically nothing written that tells the story of older gay men. And if somebody started writing those stories, would you read it?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, a few people would, great. Just thought I'd throw that out there. But at any rate, yeah, but I think it resonates because back when we were young, we felt so much more alone and so few people were telling our stories.
I mean, I think that's why Heartstopper has taken off the way it has, because it's you know, a lot of the older people are realizing that wasn't their life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but they're rejoicing in the fact that they can have it now.
All right, well, again, thank you so much for coming. Please eat food, please drink. And if I haven't signed your book yet, please, I'd love to do that now. And if you have any other questions you think of offline, one last plug. If you scan this, there you go. You can join my mailing list. I only send out an email like every other week, so I'm not gonna, you know, spam your inbox. But you get a free short story when you sign up. This actually has Brian and Ted taking their first gay cruise. If you were to arrange this chronologically, this story comes after the third book and before the fourth. But they meet people on this cruise from here, and they end up being some of his friends, and they help them get integrated in the community here. So it's a half-hour read. Last January, he and I were on a cruise ship in the Caribbean, and there were 4 days at sea. And it was a wonderful experience, but 4 days at sea. So I sat there and started writing. And by the end of the cruise, I had this story. I mean, I edited it and all that stuff, but still. Hopefully you'll find that interesting. It gives you a little more insight into some of the characters. So you can just scan that and join the mailing list. Unsubscribe if you get tired of it. All right. Again, thank you.